out there, and welcome to C is for Columbia. I think this is episode 8, and we're going to have a really good show for you today. We've taken about a 2-week hiatus. I think we've had trouble scheduling, but we are back, and I'm rather excited because I'm going into this totally blind. I am excited to see what Sam brings to the table. So with that,
Well, we have pretty good timing though, because something pretty amazing, well, pretty controversial just happened. So, as we know, there was some kind of balloon sailing over the United States of America. We're under the impression it may have been a Chinese spy balloon, although China's insisting it's a lost weather balloon. I'm not sure how a weather balloon would get lost and then sent over the United States. But you know what? We have limited information. We don't really know. But Biden did, since I started writing this script, shoot it down. I think if I remember correctly, just off of the coast of South Carolina. They waited because they didn't want any potential debris to fall and potentially injure anyone in the United States, which I think is understandable. I have heard some people say we should have shot it down faster. But I mean, I think with like potential debris and the blowback that could happen from that in terms of like property damage, traffic accidents, in my opinion, it's understandable that we did wait until it flew over the United States. Um, yeah, at the time I was writing this, they were saying in terms of like where will it go, whether the U.S. military will ultimately opt to shoot it from the sky. At that point, at the time this NBC News article was written, was up in the air. We didn't know. But the United States is dismissing the idea that it's a weather balloon that got blown off of track. So I don't know. We haven't really talked a lot of national security on this show previously, at least from what I can remember. Um, so I think this is kind of an interesting turn of events for our podcast. I mean, I guess like I'd say a few things here. Like, I guess the first question I'd have is what exactly, if this was a spy balloon, what was China's intention with this? Because there's a few things I kind of have in mind. I mean, one, they may have been looking at potential, nuclear spots in terms of where we may have reactors or missiles or something of that nature. And that's something that's been thrown around a little bit. I do wonder, though, if there wasn't really any like strategic importance to this, and maybe if China just wanted to kind of like Cold War style test us and see what we would do if they decided to fly a balloon across the entire United States from the west side to the east coast. And that's kind of one thing I was thinking is this just a test, or do they just want to see how we would react with China? Essentially, what they did is they invaded our airspace, and that's not something that happens in the United States very often, is invasion of airspace. So I don't know, maybe there's something that I guess you can't find on Google Maps that they wanted to look at. Maybe this was just some kind of a test to see what would the United States do, or how would they react. How would Joe Biden react? Is Joe Biden a strong president? Is he a weak president? Would he just let this happen? My understanding is that Biden was pretty upset about the ordeal, and he wanted to shoot it down. Oh, the interview I saw with Joe Biden was that he did state that he initially wanted to shoot it down, almost immediately, but his security advisors kind of persuaded him to wait until it's off the coast and shoot it down then. So that's Biden's story. Whether that's true or not, there's no way of really knowing. But I mean, this does feel very like Cold War-esque. I mean, China seems to kind of want to poke at us a little bit and kind of see what we can get away with. How strong is the United States? I certainly don't know that I'd consider this an act of war, but I mean, I do think, kind of like what I was saying earlier, we are getting a little, Cold War vibes from this action. It's kind of back in the Cold War. We'd sort of test each other, see how, the United States would react to one thing, how Russia back then would react to another thing. So I don't know. Maybe there is something they wanted to see, some footage that I guess maybe would have been beneficial to them. At this point, we don't really have any way of knowing. But then my other point is that maybe this was just sort of a psychological mind game type of situation that they were testing us to see how would the United States of America react to us invading their airspace. Ted, what do you think about this?
Testing. You're testing the environment, testing the political environment of Biden's attitude towards China. That's what I kind of took away from the balloon thing. And I say that because I can't imagine, as you said, that there was too much strategical benefit from flying that balloon over America. First of all, the awareness of it, it was at an altitude and at it was a size of which that it would become obvious to the United States intelligence that that was happening, that that balloon was flying. Um, Honestly, I am not certain how the United States intelligence figured out it came from China, except perhaps it had particular markings that were obviously Chinese. Um, but I do think that it is an opportunity for them to test the current administration and current government as far as what the reaction would be for one, and also if China knows that domestically in the United States, China is a hot button issue regarding uh, domestic politics within the United States. So I think that it could have been them also pushing a domestic challenge towards the Biden administration, and just see, yeah, in a way, what would America's response be, and how would they react? I do think that obviously them not shooting it down over a crowded area or a public area where it might hurt people, that's a smart decision. So I don't suspect any funny business was happening there. So they waited until they could shoot it down, and then they shot it down. It was funny to me how much press it got. And you know, that could have been totally a plan from China to try to enrage or to stir up controversy within the American press, try and get them talking again about China as an actor within on the world stage. Truth be told, I don't know if there's any comparable situation that America has been put in with regards to China. Has America ever flown a unmanned aircraft without permission over Chinese airspace? I don't know. And if so, what was the result of that? So it certainly could be seen as a probing of sorts by China, whether or not a strategic probing, a more of a political probing.
I mean, I guess we won't really know for the time being. I mean, as we're recording this the balloon just got shot down yesterday, so this is pretty recent. I think a lot of times when we cover stories, they tend to be more philosophical or more past tense. So this is like really an ongoing issue that we're kind of covering live, which doesn't always happen for us. I guess the question is that if so like China invaded our airspace, how should the United States respond strategically to this? I'm not really sure what the appropriate response would be to flying a balloon, but the issue is they did invade our airspace. So I mean, I think it's not even so much about, of course the United States would shoot the balloon down eventually. I don't think anybody in China really thought that they just ignored this. But I mean, what does the United States do from a geopolitical standpoint? I mean, should there be some kind of retaliation? If there is a retaliation, what can you really do without starting, a more hectic global conflict? I mean, we're obviously not going to invade China, and that would be like completely ridiculous and benefit really nobody. But I mean, you do have to think from a geopolitical standpoint, there should probably be some sort of response to this. I mean, I don't know if doing nothing necessarily benefits us, and I'm not a very hawkish person. And I mean, we may even have to revisit this issue, ideally next week when we record our new show, as more information comes out, because I do imagine there will be some kind of geopolitical response. Biden's not an especially hawkish person, but I mean, I do think that from the United States standpoint, like there probably will be some kind of like strategic response to this and not just, public statements, I guess.
Yeah, I think that there will be a response in kind, basically. So the response to sending a balloon over, and if the goal perceived by the United States was to cause some form of panic, if that's the goal, is to enrage and engage with domestic issues within the United States with regards to China, I think that the United States could respond in kind by uh, in a way, probing China in some way. I'm not sure how that would look, but to probe the institutions within China, which are dealing with foreign affairs, dealing with America, to try and get them to also feel like, we see this, the United States sending a message of we see this, and we are responding by also making you ask the same questions about us that you want us to answer about you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And and I go totally off topic, but I was wondering the other day, like if Trump had been president, how he would have handled this situation. So I think I will say this: there'd probably be a huge difference between Trump and Biden in terms of how this would have been handled, most likely. Besides just yeah, besides just like tons of I guess Twitter posts, at the very least, but.
Or what was the Republican caucus response? Do you know?
Well, okay, so the Republican, if we're just talking about like Republicans in general, there was kind of the idea. I did hear a lot of this. We need to shoot the balloon down now. Biden's weak for not shooting the balloon. And the thing is, this is just like political fodder. This is just something they can
Sure.
use to make Joe Biden seem like, oh, he's a weak president. Democrats are weak on foreign policy. They just let, a Chinese spy balloon fly over the United States. But it's just like from a practical standpoint, like, what would you do? Like, if I had like spy balloon debris like fall on my condo, I'd be a little upset with
Anyone
Joe
would, yeah.
Biden. So, I mean, the United States is fairly dense. I mean, there probably wasn't really that many spots where they could strategically and safely uh, push, get rid of the balloon and shoot it down. But I have been seeing that a lot from Republicans, especially in Congress, McCarthy and people such as they are, kind of criticizing Biden for not shooting down the balloon. And I just think it's political fodder at this point. I think it's just this is an opportunity for the Republican Party, to make Joe Biden look like a weak president. And I think stuff like that is like mostly predictable.
Yeah, that is very predictable that the Republicans would say, or the opposing party would say that the party of a different color, the president of a different color, is being weak on any issue, really.
So, kind of moving away from foreign policy, I'm going to bring up something a little bit more domestic. So, from AP News, there's an article about school lunches and new rules that would limit the amount of sugar in school lunches. So, I'm kind of quoting the article here. Under the plan, for instance, an 8 ounce of container of chocolate milk would contain no more than 10 grams of sugar. Some popular flavored milks now contain twice the amount. The plan also limits sugary grain desserts such as muffins or donuts to no more than twice a week at breakfast. And the idea is that by the fall of 2027, added sugars in school meals would be limited to less than 10% of the total calories per week for breakfasts and lunches. And then one other thing, I think this may even be more important, is that the proposal would also reduce sodium in school meals by 30% by the fall of 2029. They would gradually be reduced and aligned with federal guidelines, which recommends Americans ages 14 and older to limit sodium to about 2,300 milligrams a day, with less for younger children. So yeah, obesity obviously is a major issue in the United States. Compared to our European counterparts, there is like a much higher percentage, I believe, of overweight citizens, and I think there always has been kind of a push. It makes me think kind of back to Michelle Obama because she was
I
very
was thinking the same thing.
yeah, she
Yep,
was very passionate about like healthy school lunches, and
of course.
I don't know that the children really appreciated it that much. I mean, I know when I was in school, I just wanted pizza and chocolate milk
Of course.
every day, but that might not be the healthiest lifestyle to eat pizza and chocolate milk 5 days a week, although it did taste good.
Yeah.
But I think so. Like we could kind of expand on this. Like this is partly because of we want to make sure kids are eating healthier meals, obviously. But I think also recently there's been a lot of studies that kind of show that sugar really is killing people. I mean, food in America has like really high concentrations of sugar and sodium, and I mean this can lead to things like obesity. So I always kind of wondered like why the United States compared to other countries has such a higher obesity rate. And I think it kind of gets into what I kind of call cultural consumerism. This is a very consumerist country. This is a very any product you want, you can get it, and you can get it for relatively cheap, in my opinion. I guess this does start like, with kids, even going into their school lunches. But I mean, the United States does have a pretty big obesity problem. And I always did wonder, like, why, compared to other countries, like, we tend to struggle with this. And I do think healthier school lunches could be beneficial. The only thing I would kind of say is if you're going to make healthier school lunches, at least make the lunches taste good, though. Because, kids should not be miserable in eating this. You know, health nut crap. They should at least be able to have like a enjoyable meal. And I just hope that we don't over focus just on calories and sugar and sodium. Like put more effort in making sure like kids at lunch do eat like appropriate meals. And I think that can even be good for mental health, in my opinion.
Oh, that's a good point too. And actually, you hit on something I was gonna bring up just at the end there. That you're probably when you're talking about school lunches and public schools, you're talking about large quantities of food being distributed throughout multiple states. If these are federal, honestly, I don't know. Are they federal programs? Are we talking about federal programs here?
I believe so. I could go back to the article. So AP News. Yeah, this looks like a federal program rather than just like a specific state.
Yeah, okay. So a federal program to distribute large amounts of food out to multiple states. So there's a few things that are coming to mind here. Um, One would be the economy of the scale that you're servicing in the Americas, and many countries service economies of scale in that way with school lunches. At least I would assume. But the unique part that I see within the American school lunch system is maximizing distribution of food for economy, for one, minimizing cost when it comes to government spending in a broad sense. So minimizing that cost usually would result in lower quality, less healthy in general food, for one thing. Um, and then, of course, the issue is kind of distilled down into, well, the food has too much sodium or the food has too much added sugar. And the political institutions look at that and say, okay, well, you want us to lower the amount of added sugar and sodium. Great, we'll do that. We'll substitute it for some other thing that maybe there's a deficiency in. But over time, that economy of scale will once again pump in too much of whatever else it is on that. Let's say it's too much magnesium. Right now, there's a magnesium deficiency in most people's diets. I don't know if you do that. There's a bit of a magnesium deficiency. And if this becomes socially aware, politically aware, maybe then they'll say, let's pump some magnesium into the school lunches. Well, over time, that will become scaled and they'll be tuned to produce lots of food with lots of magnesium at scale. And that will become a problem in and of itself because too much magnesium and you've got other problems. You got kidney issues, you got lots of other problems. But most people don't have that issues because they have a deficiency in it. If you have too much of it, of course, you get other issues. So in that, I think that the key is that you're talking about large scale production at an economic cost, produced for an economy of scale. They're changing the food to not necessarily be quote unquote healthier, but more socially palatable. They're changing the food to be more palatable to the parents who complain about sodium levels and sugar levels. So, okay, great. We'll change it. We'll do this new thing. Maybe I don't know what that new thing looks like, but we'll reduce the amount of sodium and the amount of added sugars, and some new problem will probably emerge, and then that will be dealt with um, within that system. So I think that Michelle Obama was fighting a very good fight. I don't see it ending anytime soon, simply because of the scales that you are talking about. So, and by very good fight, I mean a long term fight, leaving a long term legacy. Because I imagine things like school lunches are going to be a problem for many years to come. They said what 2027 they're gonna reduce the added sugar to below 10% for
Yeah,
every.
so basically, sugar fall of 2027, sodium will be reduced by 30% by fall of 2029, so towards the end of this
Well,
decade.
that's a long term one, and maybe Michelle Obama will be back in schools doing her thing as a prior first lady and talking about eating healthy. So
Yeah.
good on you, Michelle. You picked a good fight.
Yeah, I know she did. I mean, it's a good for legacy. I mean, in general, like just with healthy foods, this is kind of interesting because like going out of like beyond just like public schools. I mean, when I was a kid, like vegan food, if you wanted vegan food, you had to like live somewhere that had a Whole
Oh yeah.
Foods or something like that. Like these days, even places like Burger King has like, the Impossible Whopper.
Yep.
And I think it is what it is it's basically economics. There is an increased demand in the last few years or so for vegan food or at the very least healthy food. And I think,
Yes.
businesses realize that and they're meeting the demand with supply and ideally making a profit off of it. I think some of these foods like the
Yep.
Impossible chicken wings or the Impossible burgers, I was never a huge fan of those. Burger King making vegan food isn't going to lead to me eating at Burger King. But I mean, there are better options though if you do want like healthier or even like strictly vegan food. It's just even at like any grocery store because I just feel like when I was a kid, if you wanted like more access to kind of like what they call health nut food or vegan food, like you had to go to like a Whole Foods or a Sprouts or maybe a Trader Joe's. But like these days, you can actually get a lot of that even just at like Walmart or standard grocery stores. So there has been a higher demand. And I think a lot of these companies are realizing that and trying to meet that demand since there is, some room for profit. In these cases. So it is interesting how the culture has kind of changed. And I think people are really, I mean, look, here's the thing, and I'm a little overweight myself. And I mean, I'll tell you, like, obesity does kill. I'm not in favor of making fun of people for their body or doing anything to like hurt their self image. But, like, I mean, people get heart attacks in their 50s. I mean, it does
Totally.
happen. It's not a guarantee you're going to make it to 80 or 90. And there probably should be more of an emphasis on, physical activity and eating healthier. Personally, I'm not vegan, but I try to eat a lot more fish and a lot less
I
red meat
love
as of the
fish.
past few
Love
years.
fish.
Yeah, salmon, you name it. And it's pretty easy to cook, in my opinion. A lot of times you can get stuff even like pre-seasoned and just throw it into the cast iron. And I do recommend that because it's just like, yeah, we do have a culture of just like way too much red meat, way too much junk food. I for instance, like instead of eating chips, I like to eat, hummus. Like I'll dip some carrots and some hummus, for instance, and I think that's like a good alternative to, Lay's potato chips or Ruffles or but even with like potato chips, like now they have all of these like baked Lay's and baked Ruffles that have like less fat. So I mean, kind of goes to my original point. There is like an increased demand of not just vegan food, but also like healthier food in general. And I do think there has been some attempt by even, some of these greedier corporations to meet that demand. I just think the reality of it, they're not doing it because they've had a change of heart about the obesity crisis. They're doing it because they realize there's a market for it. and they want to profit off of that market if possible.
And I was going to say, so the demand, you mentioned the demand increase. I agree 100%. It's also become very cost effective to go with plant-based stuff. Research into food science and research into developing these things is very costly up front. Now that that research has been it's not done, obviously, research is never done, but a lot of research has gone into it, and that has brought the cost of doing that sort of thing significantly down. And overall, the raw input cost for something that's plant-based is almost always going to be cheaper than anything that is raised or farmed, like a cow or chicken, poultry, whatever. The other thing I was going to say is seafood. I am a huge seafood fan. And seafood doesn't necessarily need to be farmed. You can overfish, of course, which hurts ecosystems. But seafood can be caught sustainably, relatively easily. You can't get as high of a margin out of those sustainable catches or sustainably caught seafood, but it can be caught sustainably, unlike cattle farming, which is seen as not very sustainable.
There's a sushi place in walking distance to me, and I make good use of that, although it is a little expensive, but love any kind of seafood.
I'm a sushi fan. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like any kind of seafood, I pretty much like. Even with sushi, I eat like sea urchins, fish eggs. I'm crazy about it, but it's not for everybody, I guess. But
Oh, mahi mahis for mihi mihi. That's what I say. I like mahi mahi.
I mean, I used to live in Seattle, well, around Seattle, so we had pretty good seafood options, fresh oysters.
Oh, I love oysters. Yeah, that's good stuff.
I love. There was a farmer's market right by me where I used to live in Washington. I would get like fresh oysters. They're a pain in the neck to open, but if you can get them open,
Yeah.
and sometimes
Yeah.
they'll be like rocks you bite into, but the oysters themselves are pretty good. Speaking of Seattle, actually, Washington State could become the second state in the nation after Utah to lower the limit of driver blood alcohol content, known as BAC, from from 0.08% to 0.05%.
Interesting.
Utah has already passed this law, which I'm not really surprised Utah would pass that, because Utah, if you like to drink, if you're a social drinker, Utah is probably not the state you want to live in. But anyway, yeah, so they're trying to pass this law. It hasn't passed yet, but it could potentially happen. So here's what I'd say. I'm a social drinker. I've never really been a fan of bar culture. I just think it's like very overpriced to drink alcohol at a bar, and then it's just you are putting yourself in a situation where you could be drinking and driving. I mean, I wouldn't want to go to a bar just to have one drink and say, well, if I have any more, I'll be over my limit. So I'd rather just make cocktails at home personally. But I actually, although I'm not like super big on government regulations when it comes to our personal lives, I think this is a good thing personally. Drinking and I've known people who have died due to this, whether because they were drinking or driving, or even, for instance, somebody I was friends with in high school. A few years after he graduated, he was driving home in Indiana, and somebody drinking and driving crashed into his car. And unfortunately, the person I went to high school with, isn't with us anymore at this point. So I've seen this happen, and I have to say, I'm a fan of this. I really think that they should go ahead and lower that. It's a really out of control issue, and it's just like totally unnecessary. So point 0.5, I'm not sure how many drinks that would be to get to 0.05. But I mean, I don't know. Maybe you know more about this than I do. But I still, generally speaking, would say I'm supportive of this measure.
The rule of thumb that I have been taught is for an adult male, one drink is about an increase in 0.02 BAC. So
Okay.
so 0.08, which I think is the federal limit,
Yes.
is about 4 drinks. And 0.05 would be 2.5 then. And I would tend to agree with you. I don't think there's any issue in lowering that limit. Um, I am not quite sure what the known effects are between zero point zero 0.05 and zero point zero 0.08, what the change in your cognitive reflexes would be, um, and what you would have to do to change a field sobriety test, too. Because a field sobriety test, I imagine, is tuned to try to find who's over that zero point zero 0.08 limit and really who's capable of operating the vehicle safely. Because that's the point of
Right.
all of that is who can operate the vehicle safely, given a certain BAC. If you get in a accident, I believe in the state of Indiana at least, it is zero tolerance, meaning if you are in an accident and you have a BAC above 0, then you will be in some trouble, especially if the accident is your fault.
Right.
If you are pulled over for any reason and your BAC is 0.08 or above, that is a DUI. So lowering that limit, I think it would discourage people from feeling like, well, I'm on the line and I'll drive anyway, and I'll get home that way. It'll discourage that sort of thing, which I think is a good thing overall. I think that's safe. So I tend to agree with you. I have no issue with them lowering that number.
Here's what I would say. Here's like what I would do. Like if I was in charge, I'd lower it to 0.05 like they want to in Washington already do have in Utah. I will say this though, I do think the drinking age should be 18 rather than 21. I think if you're old enough to get drafted, you should be able to buy a 6-pack at a grocery store and have a couple beers. Yeah, and personally, I've never really drunk and drive. I've never, even when I was more social when I was younger, I didn't really like hanging out at bars. I just always felt like you could buy a 6-pack of Heineken for the price of a couple beers at a bar. So, I mean, I'm not like, I don't want to give off the impression that I'm a heavy drinker, but if I drink, I usually just, buy a 6-pack and have a couple of beers and maybe a cigar. And that's, how I always, the only times I've really gone to bars is like if I was going on a date. Basically, like maybe I'd buy somebody like a glass of wine or a White Claw.
Sure.
You get the picture. But in terms of just like a day-to-day basis, I don't really hang out at bars. I never really saw the appeal of hanging out at bars. But I mean, yeah, get an Uber, get a taxi, get a Lyft. You should not. If you want to hang out at a bar all night, that's fine. But like, have somebody drive you home. And yeah, I mean, I'd say that is totally fair. And, I'm happy of Washington, the state I used to live in, implementing that. It's interesting because Washington is kind of known as more of a drug friendly state. They were one of the first states to legalize marijuana. For instance, a lot of people don't realize they did it the same year Colorado legalized it. Colorado was technically the first, basically because of time zones, but it's a 1A, 1B type of thing. So, I mean, Washington's not a strict state when it comes to recreational use. So it's kind of interesting to me that they're the ones kind of leading the initiative here to lower the blood alcohol content for driving.
Yeah, lower the limit, or make the limit more strict in that sense. Uh, yeah, you brought up drinking age and how you would see it lowered to 18. And I would tend to agree with that. A lot of the world has their drinking age and most of their age of majority at 18, 16 to 18. I think in Europe there are some. France, I think the drinking age is 16. But
Yeah, I think Italy too.
I actually imagine if I could um have a prediction, if I could make a prediction that the age of tobacco use was at one point 18, and that has since shifted to 21.
Yep.
So I don't foresee the drinking age going down anytime soon. I think actually we're probably gonna move the age of majority slowly upwards in America rather than bring it back down. That's a prediction.
Right.
Whether or not that's a good, bad thing, I don't know, but that's the trend that I see.
Yeah, absolutely. And even marijuana, like I live in a state where marijuana is legal. You have to be 21 to use marijuana. I think out of the three drugs we just discussed, nicotine, alcohol, and marijuana is probably the safest. Like if you were to bring one of those three down to 18, marijuana would probably have the least amount of social consequences, I would
Yeah.
imagine. That's actually why a lot of places, because some of these places had medical marijuana before they had legal marijuana. Medical marijuana, you only need to be 18. I was 20 years old living in California.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and I had a medical marijuana card, so I was only 20. But it's kind of interesting. I could buy weed, but I couldn't buy alcohol.
Huh.
Yeah, I mean that's like a whole nother thing with like legalized weed. There's a lot of bureaucratic issues that we could probably get into at another time. But yeah, I've lived in Washington, California, and Arizona, and was able to use THC products there legally if I chose to.
I believe the age of 21 is a federal number.
Yes.
Yes, so that cannot be lowered by the states. But it could be theoretically increased. Um, I don't know why we might see that. The only reason there might be a push to actually increase the age of alcohol consumption is if colleges, let's say if a Bernie Sanders character got in as the president and was able to reconstruct the college system into a more publicly available system, making it more like going to college is like going to high school. In that sense, you pick a college, and then there's a government program through which you go through it. Much more access to colleges in general. I could then see there being some issue, in the same way that you have some 18-year-olds in high school handing out whatever cigarettes to the minors in high school. I could see there being a push to discourage that in colleges. It happens already in colleges with alcohol, by the way. Anyway, there are 21-year-olds in college who buy it for the 18-year-olds at parties, whatever. But if there's a shift to then, well, these colleges are now public schools, that changes the issue entirely. And I think then you might see a much stronger push to get the alcohol out of the hands of the college, quote unquote, college kids, which might result in the drinking age going up to like 22 or 23, which would be ridiculous in my opinion. And it's not even on the table, but in some circumstances, I could see that happening.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say is I do hear that, like, your brain doesn't stop developing until you're 25, but I can't imagine bringing, like, the drinking and smoking age up to 25 would go too well with a lot of people.
Broadly speaking, the age of majority, when people are going to be considered age-wise to be fully functioning members of society, basically adults, what we would call adults, and how throughout the last 2 centuries at least, that number has continued to tick up. At one point, maybe 3 centuries ago in the 1700s, 14 or 15 was about that age. Legalistically, 18 had been historically the age since about World War II. A little prior to World War II, probably like the 1910s, 18 was that age. And that number continuing to tick up, it's a very slow increase, but I imagine that number will continue to rise over the next few centuries. I don't see that stopping. So, like you mentioned, there'll be a rationalization of, well, the brain doesn't stop developing until 25. And that could be a rationalization used to then make the age cutoff 25 for what is considered a child or what is considered someone who is not a fully functioning member of society just yet. And that could have a lot of consequences that I can't predict decades and decades out into the future, obviously, as no one can. But it's something that I've considered for a while, the age of majority increasing and increasing in America and in the world in general.
One last thing I wanted to bring up as we kind of conclude our show. Have you heard that Bill Maher is partnering with CNN currently? So he has a segment.
Yeah.
Yeah, he has a segment at the end of the show that doesn't show up if you have HBO Max, but you can see it on YouTube, called Overtime, where him and his guests have like a 10-minute casual conversation, basically, where everybody kind of like lays, just kind of like putzes around and, talks about these issues a little bit more freely, I suppose. That's going to start be showing on CNN. CNN had been talking about bringing in somebody, a bit of a comedian, to try to get their ratings up. I mean, they didn't say it like that, but that's why they're doing it. I just thought that was kind of interesting because Bill Maher is a pretty politically incorrect person, and CNN is like the most politically correct news station I think you're going to get that has a lot of viewers. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. I watched Bill Maher. I have HBO Max, so usually on a Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon, I'll just kind of watch the show. I just thought that was kind of interesting that now CNN is kind of, reaching out to Bill Maher to kind of bring their ratings up.
I think, yeah, I think Bill Maher is a decent character to do that because their ratings have declined quite a bit, and their viewership is also rather old in general, CNN's. And I think Bill Maher kind of meets in the middle somewhere because Bill Maher's viewership is also relatively old. My mom likes Bill Maher, as an example, and his viewership is on the older side of the media pool in general. So I think that CNN bringing him on is probably a decent move because it will expand a little bit. At least it's a pull for some people who hadn't taken CNN very seriously to kind of add some levity that is palatable levity. It's not so out there that their current viewers will be disgusted by it, but also it is not so dry that it's just more of the same.
Well, I think that was a pretty good show. We're aiming to try to do these once a week. Sometimes it's just, Ted has a life, I have a life, and sometimes the stars don't align. But ideally, we should be, doing this once every week or every other week for those of you who have, just started listening. Ted, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, it's been a great discussion about the Chinese children's lunches and the age of childhood in general. And Bill Maher. Bill Maher also came up. So I hope everyone out there enjoyed listening. I hope we gave you something to think about. And hope we didn't ruffle your feathers too much. With that, we will see you next time.